One night under the stars changed what two cowboys promised forever. The fire had burned down to orange coals by the time Cole Dunnigan said the thing he'd been carrying since Missouri. I remember the smell of the grass. Late September, maybe 2 miles south of the Cimarron, and the air had that particular sharpness, cold coming in under the warmth, the way it does when the season is making up its mind. We'd been riding 4 days out of Pueblo, and neither of us had said much worth saying. Cole had that look he got when something was eating at him from the inside, jaw held a certain way, eyes going out past whatever was in front of him. I'd ridden with Cole for 11 years by then, and I knew that jaw. My name is Earl Hatch. I was 43 years old that September, though I felt older. Felt like a man who'd been carried a long way past where he'd meant to go and wasn't entirely sure how to turn back. I want to tell you about that night. Not because it ended well, it did, but that's not why. I want to tell it because it was the night I understood something about the promises a man makes when he's young and hurting, and what happens when those promises outlive their reason. When the only thing left holding them up is pride. And I want to tell it because of what Nora did and how she did it, and because I've never said any of this out loud to a single living soul, and I'm tired of carrying it alone. Cole and I had met in the fall of 1867 on a cattle drive out of Texas. Him, 17, me, 18. Both of us too young to know what we were getting into and too stubborn to admit it when we found out. We'd been together through 3 drives, a winter in Abilene that I'd rather forget, a stretch of fence work up in Colorado that nearly broke us both, and then the years with Ardmore's outfit down in New Mexico working horses. Cole had a younger brother named Lou. Lou Dunnigan was the kind of man that other men liked instantly, easy laugh, good with his hands, never seemed to be afraid of anything. I'd known Lou nearly as long as I'd known Cole. We'd all 3 worked together at Ardmore's for 2 years. In the spring of 1878, 2 men named Brackett and Sutter rode onto Ardmore's range and shot Lou Dunnigan off his horse over a dispute about a line of fence that wasn't even Lou's to defend. He died before we got him back to the bunkhouse. I watched Cole change that afternoon. It wasn't dramatic. That's what I remember most. He didn't rage, didn't break things. He just got very still, very quiet, and his eyes went somewhere I hadn't seen them go before, and they mostly stayed there after that. That evening, the 2 of us sat outside, and Cole looked at the ground and said, "I'm going to find them." I said, "I know." He said, "You don't have to come." I said, "I know that too." We left Ardmore's the next morning. That was the promise. Not a thing stated with ceremony, not a hand shaken or a word sworn on a Bible. Just 2 men who understood each other riding out together in one direction with one purpose, Brackett and Sutter. We tracked them for 8 months. Found Brackett in Laredo the following winter. I won't say what happened, but there wasn't a trial. Cole stood very still afterward and looked at his hands for a long time. We rode north. Sutter was harder. He'd gone up into Wyoming, changed his name, taken work on a sheep operation north of Cheyenne. It took us most of another year to find him with any certainty, and by then it was the fall of 1880, 2 years gone from Ardmore's, from Lou, from anything resembling the life we'd had before. That's where we were riding that September, north toward Wyoming, toward Sutter, and that's where we stopped, 2 miles south of the Cimarron, and built a fire, and Cole said the thing he'd been carrying. He said, "Earl, I think I'm done." I looked at him across the coals. He said, I'm tired. I've been tired for a year, and I've been pretending I wasn't. Lou's been dead 2 years. Brackett's dead. And I don't know if killing Sutter makes Lou any less dead, and I don't know if I care anymore, and I don't know what that means about me." He wasn't looking at me when he said it, looking at the coals. I sat with it a while. The wind came through the grass with a sound like water, and somewhere out in the dark, a coyote made one short noise and stopped. I said, "I think it means you're human." He didn't say anything. I said, "Cole, what do you want to do?" He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "I want to stop. I want to go somewhere and work and maybe have a life that isn't this. But I don't know how to do that without feeling like I left Lou behind." I understood that. I understood it more than I'd admitted to myself. We'd been riding so long on the momentum of that promise that I hadn't stopped to ask myself what was underneath it anymore. Grief, yes. Anger, yes, at the start. But by that second year, what was left wasn't grief so much as habit. The promise had become its own reason for existing. We kept it not because it served Lou's memory, but because we didn't know who we were without it. I said, I'll follow your lead. Cole nodded once. We sat there a while longer, and then we rolled our blankets out, and I lay on my back looking up at the sky. I want to tell you about that sky, because I've seen 1,000 nights out under open country and most of them blur together, but that one doesn't. The Milky Way was directly overhead, thick and cold-looking, more stars than dark between them, and the moon was down, so there was nothing to compete with it. I lay there looking up and I thought, a man could make any promise under a sky like this and mean it completely. And a man could lie under this same sky and realize the promise doesn't fit him anymore, and that be just as true. I thought about what I wanted, not what Cole wanted, not what Lou deserved, not what we owed anyone, what I, Earl Hatch, wanted. And the honest answer was, I didn't know. I was 43 years old and I had a horse and a saddle and a bedroll and a rifle and 2 good hands that knew fence work and horses and no particular place to be and no particular person waiting for me anywhere. I had Cole and the promise, and that was about the whole of it. I fell asleep with that sky above me, and I had a dream about nothing in particular, just riding through green country with the sun on my shoulders. And when I woke up it was gray and cold, and a woman was standing at the edge of our camp holding a rifle. She wasn't pointing it at us. She was standing about 20 feet away at the edge of the firelight, and the rifle was across her chest, one hand on the forestock, barrel down. She was watching Cole, who was already awake and sitting up. I lay still for a moment and took stock. Tall woman, dark hair pulled back rough. Wearing a man's coat, wool, too big for her, the cuffs rolled, and trousers and boots that had been resoled at least twice. She had a look on her face that I can only describe as, I am not afraid of you, but I am not foolish either. Cole said, morning. She said, you're on Harlow's land. Cole said, we didn't see a fence. She said, there isn't one. Harlow doesn't like fences. She glanced at me. Your friend awake? I said, yes, ma'am. She said, I saw your fire last night. Harlow sent me out to have a look. A pause. You're not the men we've been watching for. Cole said, who have you been watching for? She said, 2 men named Brackett and Sutter, and she said it matter-of-factly, like she was naming the weather. I sat up. Cole went very still. She was watching us both. Whatever she saw in our faces, she didn't show a reaction to it. She said Harlow had trouble with them 4 months back. They ran off 3 of his horses and beat one of his hands badly enough that the man still walks with a limp. Sheriff in Caldwell did nothing. Harlow's been waiting for them to come back through. Cole said carefully, Brackett's dead. She looked at him, when? Last winter, Laredo. She said, and Sutter. Still north, far as we know. She was quiet for a moment. The gray light was getting stronger and I could see her face better now. Mid-30s, maybe. A strong face, not beautiful in any soft way, but the kind of face you look at and think, there's someone home behind those eyes. A scar at the corner of her jaw, faint. Her hands on the rifle were steady and unhurried. She said, you're after him. Cole said, we were. She caught the past tense, looked at him a long moment. Then she said, come up to the house. Harlow will want to talk to you. Harlow's place was 1.5 miles north, a sod-roofed ranch house with a decent barn and a windmill that needed work. Older man, 60 or so, one arm gone at the shoulder, lost it in the war, he said, though he didn't say which side and I didn't ask. He was quiet and deliberate, and he shook our hands and looked us in the eyes, and I liked him immediately. The woman's name was Nora Vane. She was Harlow's niece, had been with him 2 years since her husband died of a fever outside Denver. She ran his house, helped with the horses, knew the range. She made coffee and set it on the table without ceremony, and then she sat down with us like it was the most natural thing and listened while Cole and Harlow talked about Sutter. About where he might be, what routes he might use coming south again. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was precise. She asked about the timing of things, the routes, the geography. She'd been up into Wyoming herself, she said, years before. She knew the country. After a while, Harlow said, you're welcome to stay a few days, rest your horses. He looked between us. You look like men who could use a rest. Cole glanced at me. I said we'd be grateful. We stayed 4 days. There was work to do. There always is on a ranch that's a man short. I spent 2 days on the windmill and got it running, and Cole repaired a section of the barn roof that had gone soft. Harlow watched and didn't say much, and every evening we ate together and talked. Nora was in and out. She was not a woman who sat still comfortably. She was either doing something or had just finished doing something or was about to go do something. She fed the horses herself and had opinions about how they were being kept that she stated plainly and without apology. She mended tack in the evenings at the table. She slept, as far as I could tell, a normal number of hours, and yet she always seemed to have been up before anyone else and still going after everyone else had quit. She was not warm, exactly. She wasn't cold either. She was direct. She looked at you when she spoke, and she listened when you spoke, and she didn't waste words on either side of a conversation. On the third evening, after Harlow had gone to bed early with a headache, it was just the three of us, me, Cole, and Nora, sitting at the table with the lamp between us, and Cole said something I wasn't expecting. He said, "Can I ask you something?" Nora looked up from the harness she was working. Cole said, "Your husband. Did he know what kind of a life it was going to be out here?" She was quiet for a moment. He thought he did. A pause. He was a city man from Cincinnati. He thought it was going to be like a novel. She turned the harness over in her hands. It wasn't, but he stayed. He worked at it. Another pause. He was a better man than he thought he was. He just never had quite enough time to figure that out. Cole nodded slowly. She looked at him. "You're thinking about stopping." Cole said, "Is it that plain?" She said, "It's plain enough." She set the harness down. She looked at both of us and then she said, "I have no opinion about what you owe the dead. That's between you and God and whoever's gone. But I'll tell you what I've seen." She looked at Cole directly. Men who ride a thing out past its reason, past the point where it's true, they don't look like men on a mission. They look like men who are afraid of who they'll be when they stop. She said it without cruelty. I don't know if that's you, but I've seen it. Cole didn't say anything. She picked the harness back up. I sat there and felt something shift in me, quiet and certain, the way a door moves in its frame when the wind changes outside. The fourth morning, before first light, I woke up and couldn't go back to sleep. I went outside and stood in the yard with a cup of water and looked up. The sky was the same as it had been 2 nights before, cold and full, the Milky Way still up there doing what it does, indifferent. I stood in it for a while. Nora came out about 20 minutes later. She had a coat on over her night clothes, and she was carrying her own cup, and she came and stood next to me without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "You're not going to Wyoming." I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Yes, you do." I thought about that. Cole has to decide for himself. She said, "I know, I'm not talking about Cole." She looked up. "I'm asking what you want." It's a strange thing to be asked that directly by someone you've known for days. It should have felt forward. It didn't. It felt like she was asking the only question that mattered and doing me the courtesy of asking it out loud. I said, "I think I'm tired." She said, "That's not the same as what you want." I stood there. The cold was getting into my hands, and I switched the cup to the other. I said, "I want a place, some work, something to show for the years." I paused, something that isn't about being on the road. She didn't say anything right away. I said, "I've been riding for 20 years, and I've got good hands, and I know horses and cattle and fence work, and that's the whole accounting." She said, "That's not a small accounting." I looked at her. She said, "Harlow needs a man. He won't say it, but his arm makes things hard and I can't do all of it. He trusts you, both of you, and it's been 2 days. She looked down at her cup. He doesn't trust people easily. I said, "He might trust Cole more than he trusts me." She said, "He trusts you equally." A pause. I'm not speaking for him. I'm telling you what I see. I looked back up at the sky. 1 star moved, a meteor, brief and gone, leaving nothing. I said, "What do you see when you look at me?" She turned and looked at me with those direct, unhurried eyes, and she said, "A man who's been doing right by someone else's grief for long enough that he's forgotten what his own life feels like. A man who knows how to work and keeps his word and doesn't make things about himself." A pause. "A man who deserves to stop." She said that last part quietly. I don't mean stop in the sense of quit. I mean stop in the sense of arrive. I had nothing to say to that. Not because it wasn't true, because it was so true that saying anything in response would have made it smaller. We stood there a while longer in the dark. At some point her shoulder was against my arm, not moving there, just there, gradually, the way warmth moves toward warmth when it's cold. I didn't move either. The stars did what stars do, which is keep on. After a while she said, "Cold." I said, "Yes." She went back inside. I stood there another minute with the sky above me, and the grass dark all around, and the windmill turning in the light wind with a small, regular sound. A sound like a clock, like something keeping time on purpose. And I understood that this was the moment, right here, and not some dramatic reckoning on a trail in Wyoming. It was this. A yard in the gray before dawn, a woman who'd looked at me and said a plain and accurate thing, and the question of what I was going to do about it. I went back inside, and I didn't sleep. At breakfast, Cole said almost nothing. Harlow was up early and moving carefully. His arm bothered him in the cold. And Nora made cornbread, and there was side pork, and we all sat and ate. And the sun came through the east window and lay across the table in a long bar. After Harlow went out to the barn, Nora cleared the table. I sat. Cole sat across from me. He said, I was thinking last night. I said, so was I, asterisk. He said, I think if Sutter comes south eventually, and he will, the men around here will deal with it. It's not something I have to do anymore. Maybe it never was, but I know it now. He looked at his hands. Lou wouldn't want this, I know that, I've known it. I just didn't want to stop because stopping felt like giving up. He looked up at me. I think I've been using the promise as a reason not to make any new ones. I said, I think that too. About me, I mean. He nodded. I said, Harlow needs men. Cole said, I know. I said you'd stay. He looked around the kitchen, out the window at the barn, the yard, the flat country beyond. Then he said, I think so. Yeah, he looked at me. You. I said, I think I'd stay a good while. He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen on his face in I don't know how long. It changed his whole face, made him look like the 17-year-old I'd met on that Texas drive, before Missouri and Laredo and all the miles between. He said, Harlow's going to need to know what he's getting. I said he can know exactly what he's getting. I'm not hiding anything. Cole said, good, he stood. I'll go talk to him. He went out. I sat there alone at the table with the sun on it, and the sound of Nora moving somewhere back in the house, the sound of an ordinary morning. I talked to Harlow that afternoon. We stood by the fence east of the barn, and he looked out at his land while I said the plain facts of it, where Cole and I had been and why, and what we'd done and where we stood with it now. I said it without embellishment and without apology. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, man comes clean like that, I respect it. I said, I don't have anything to hide. You'd find out anyway, in a country this size. He said, that's true. He looked at me sideways. Cole says the same story. I said, yes. He said, all right then. He turned back to the fence. Winter's coming. I need the barn sound, the upper pasture fenced before freeze, and the windmill will need servicing again in February. That work for you? I said, that works fine. He nodded, room and board and 40 a month, fair. I said, fair. We shook. That evening was different. Harlow brought out a bottle he'd apparently been saving and poured 4 glasses, and we sat around the table, and he and Cole talked about Texas. Harlow had driven cattle there once, years back, and Nora sat with her cup of coffee and didn't drink the whiskey but didn't leave either. The lamp was bright. Outside, the wind had picked up and you could hear it at the corners of the house, but inside it was warm and still. At some point, Harlow and Cole got deep into a conversation about the best way to winter horses. One of those arguments that is really just 2 men who like the same things agreeing with each other at length. And Nora and I were sitting with a quiet between us that was easy. She said, did you talk to him? I said, Harlow, yes. She looked at me. I said, we're staying. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, good, just that, not effusive, just good, like something had been confirmed. I said, you planned this. She looked surprised, genuinely, I thought. I didn't plan anything. I said, you said what you said last night under the stars. You knew what it would do. She thought about that. I said what was true. I didn't plan it. I've been watching men let their lives go sideways for a long time. She looked at the table. My husband nearly did it. He nearly went back to Cincinnati because he thought the life out here was too hard and he didn't have what it took. I sat with him one night and I said, what do you want? Not asterisk, what do you think you should do, or what did you tell people you'd do? Just what do you want? She looked up at me. He stayed, he worked, he was happy here, a pause. I just asked you the same thing. I said, and I gave you the same answer he did. She said, you gave yourself the answer. I just asked. I looked at her for a moment. In the lamplight she looked, I don't know how to say it right, not soft. She wasn't a soft woman. But there was something warm in how she sat there, something that had come up from underneath the practical and the direct, like the ground in spring when it starts to give. I said, I'm glad you asked. She held my eyes for a moment. Then Cole said something from across the table that required an answer, and the moment moved on, the way moments do, but it moved somewhere, not nowhere. I could feel it. We worked hard that first month. The upper pasture fence was worse than it looked. 3 sections needed replacing entirely, not just repair. And the barn had a problem with the drainage around the foundation that I didn't discover until we were well into it, and that cost us nearly a week. Cole was better with wood than I was, and I was better with the ditching and the masonry, so we divided it without ceremony and kept pace with the cold coming in. We worked mornings until the light gave out, which that time of year wasn't long. Came in smelling of dirt and sweat and sat at the table and ate what Nora put in front of us without complaint, which wasn't difficult because she was a good cook, plain food, nothing fancy, but made right. The kind of food that tells you someone understood what you needed before you had to say it. Hot coffee in the dark, salt pork and beans that had been on since morning, cornbread when she had the time for it. I ate more those first weeks than I had in months on the trail, and slept heavier, and woke up stiff in ways that told me the work was real. Harlow worked alongside us when he could. With one arm, he was still faster than most 2-armed men at the tasks he knew, and he knew this land the way a man knows his own hands. He taught us things about the specific character of this stretch of country, where the water ran, where it didn't, where the wind came from and where it eddied and stalled, which draws were treacherous in the wet, which high ground was safe in a storm. He taught us without lecturing, just by doing and saying the plain facts as they came up. He'd been here 20 years and the land had his shape in it. The fence lines ran where the ground made sense for them. The windmill was placed where the prevailing wind was strongest. The barn doors faced away from the worst weather. A man had thought carefully about this place over a long time, and it showed. Cole liked him. I could see it from the first day, the way Cole watched Harlow work, easy and attentive, the way he listened when the older man spoke. Cole had grown up without a father worth mentioning, and I think Harlow gave him something he'd missed without knowing he was missing it. They'd argue comfortably about small things, the right tool for a job, the best way to winter the horses, whether a particular fence section needed 2 posts or 3, and the arguments were the kind where both men were really just enjoying the talking. I didn't intrude on it. It was theirs. Nora moved through all of it like weather, present and purposeful, and not particularly interested in being remarked upon. She rode out with us twice to inspect the pasture fence line, and she was as useful as either of us. Better on one section where the original post placement had been wrong from the start and needed thinking out before it needed fixing. She sat her horse and looked at the problem and said, "Move the anchor here, run the line at this angle, you won't have the tension issue." She was right. I watched her those weeks. I wasn't hiding it. I don't think I was capable of hiding much from her anyway, and I don't think she minded. There was something between us that was building without being discussed, the way a wall goes up one course at a time, each piece fitting and set before the next goes on. There was an evening in the second week, a Wednesday, I think, though the days ran together, when Harlow was in town and Cole had ridden over to check on the north water hole, and it was just Nora and me in the house. She was going through the household accounts at the table, and I was mending a bridle by the fire. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Not uncomfortable silence. The other kind, the kind where 2 people have already established something between them that doesn't require talking. She said without looking up, "You rode through Kansas." I said, "Lived there a stretch. Why?" She said, "I grew up there, Abilene." She turned a page. "It was an ugly town when I was small." I said, "It was ugly when I was there too." She said, "My father ran cattle into it, before the railroad changed everything." I said, "What happened to him?" She said, "Cholera 1873, plain, not asking for sympathy. My mother remarried, a decent man, she's in Missouri now." I said, "Do you see her?" She said, "Every 2 years or so. She sends letters in between." She paused. "She wants me to come back east." I said, "But you don't want to." She looked up at me then. "No, I don't." She held my eyes for a moment, something in her expression that was almost amused. "This is where I'm from now, Kansas or Colorado or here, it's all the same country. It fits me." She looked back down. "Missouri doesn't fit me." I understood that. Some country fits you and some doesn't, and you know the difference when you're in it. I'd spent years in places that didn't fit, and I recognized what it felt like to be in one that did. I thought about saying something to that effect and decided against it. Some things keep better unspoken until the right time. I watched her those weeks. I wasn't hiding it. I don't think I was capable of hiding much from her anyway, and I don't think she minded. There was something between us that was building without being discussed. The way a wall goes up one course at a time, each piece fitting and set before the next goes on. One afternoon in late October, I was up on the barn roof relaying shingles where the water had been getting in, and she came out of the house and stood in the yard below and looked up at me and said, "Supper in an hour." I said, "All right." She stood there a moment. I said something else. She said, "No, then, you're doing it wrong." I looked at what I was doing. She said, "The overlap. You want more on the uphill side or you'll be up here again in February." I looked at the overlap. She was right. She said, "I'd say you can figure it out from here." She went back inside. I sat on the roof in the cold and looked out at the flat country going brown and gold to the horizon, and I laughed, actually laughed, out loud, alone on the roof, for the first time in I don't know how long. It was a night in November when she kissed me, and I want to tell it right. There was a storm coming. You could feel it all day, that particular pressure in the air, the horses nervous, the sky turning the color of an old bruise to the northwest. We'd spent the afternoon making sure everything that needed to be secured was secured, and after dark when the wind really came up and the first hard snow started against the windows, we were all four inside, which felt like the right place to be. Harlow fell asleep in his chair. Cole went to his bunk early. He'd been up since before light. The lamp was low and the fire was good, and Nora and I were the last two awake. She at the table with some figures she was working through for Harlow, me with my back against the wall near the fire, half reading an old newspaper I'd already read. The storm got louder. The house held. She put her pencil down and looked at the window, where the snow was hitting the glass in gusts, and she said, "This is a good house." I said, "It is." She said, "Harlow built it himself, mostly, before the war." I said, "A man could build something in a place like this and have it stand." She looked at me then. She held her head a certain way, slightly tilted, reading something. Then she closed her ledger and she stood, and she came over to where I was, and she crouched down in front of me, and she took my face in both her hands, and she looked at me close, the way you look at something you want to be sure of. Then she kissed me. It wasn't a long kiss. It was steady and certain, and when she pulled back she was still close, her hands still on my jaw, and she was looking at me in the firelight with those eyes that didn't hide anything, and she said, "I'm not a woman who does things she doesn't mean." I said, "I know that." She said, "I mean this." I said, "I know that too." She held my face a moment longer, like she was making sure I understood. Then she let go and she stood, and she went back to the table and picked up her pencil, and I sat against the wall with the fire on one side of me and the storm outside, and I thought, there it is. There is the rest of whatever I have. I won't tell you we didn't have hard months after that. We did. There were things about me she didn't like, and she said them plainly. I had a stubbornness that was useful in fence building and less useful in argument, and I could go quiet in a way that frustrated her, and she told me so. There were things about her I had to learn. She didn't want to be managed or protected beyond what she asked for, and sometimes she needed to be alone, and that needed to be allowed without it being about me. We were two people who'd been alone a long time, and solitude had made certain shapes in us that didn't always fit together cleanly. The worst stretch was February, when we'd been close for 3 months, and the newness had worn down and the actual work of it had shown up. A cold snap had kept us all inside for 4 days running, and the house got small and we snapped at each other about nothing. The way a fire was laid, the way something had been stored, words that weren't about the thing being said. She went cold on me for 2 days in a way that was worse than anger, and I went out to the barn and stayed longer than I needed to and came back when I'd decided what I was willing to say. I said, "I'm not leaving." She looked at me from across the room. I said, "Whatever this is, the hard part of it, I'm not leaving. I want you to know that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know you're not." And the cold went out of her and she came over and she stood next to me, not touching, just standing close, and after a minute her hand found my arm and stayed there. She said, "I'm not leaving either. I just needed you to say it." I said, I'll try to remember to say it. She said, I'll try to make it easier too. That was February. By March the cold broke and we were all right again, and something had been said between us that hadn't needed to be said again since. But she didn't leave. I didn't leave. We worked at it the way Cole's husband had worked at it, as a thing worth the doing. By spring, it was understood between us without being said. By the following fall, I had said it, not in any staged moment, not with the lamp low and the words arranged, but at the fence line on a cold morning with my breath in the air and hers beside it and the whole plain watching. I said, I love you, Nora. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me, and then she said it back, simply looking at me the way she looked at everything, directly, without flinching, meaning every word. Cole stayed 2 years with Harlow. Toward the end of the second year, he met a woman named Bertie Estes at a dance in Caldwell, a schoolteacher from Indiana who was almost shockingly cheerful compared to anything else Cole had ever been around. She made him laugh constantly, and he looked baffled and delighted by this in equal measure. He married her in the spring of '83, and they moved to a small place he built on the east section that Harlow sold him for a fair price. The day before Cole moved out of Harlow's house, we sat outside in the evening, and we had a conversation that was mostly quiet. He said at some point, "Do you think about Wyoming?" I said, "Not much, you." He said, "Sometimes, less than I used to." He looked out at the country. "I think Lou would have liked Bertie." I said, "He'd have been terrified of her." Cole smiled. I said, "He'd have married someone exactly like her." Cole nodded. We sat a while. He said, "I'm glad we stopped when we stopped." I said, "So am I." He looked at me. "You think about what would have happened if we'd kept north." I said, "I think we'd have found Sutter. I think it would have gone one way or another, and then we'd have had nothing to come back to." He said, "We'd have kept riding." I said, "Until one of us couldn't." He looked at his hands. Lou wouldn't have wanted that. He would have told us to stop and live if he could have. I said, "I know." Then why'd it take so long? I thought about it. Because living is harder to give yourself permission for than dying is. Because dying for someone is clean and simple, and living for yourself feels like it might mean you didn't love them enough. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "That's about right." I married Nora in the summer of 1882 in Harlow's yard on a day that was hot and still. The sky blew the way a sky only gets in the deep of summer. Harlow stood up for me. Cole and Bertie came, and 2 of the hands from the neighboring ranch who'd become friends over the winter. The preacher from Caldwell rode out, a young man who was earnest and said the right words and didn't take too long. When Nora took my hand, it was the way she always took it, certain. Like she decided to and meant to, and that was the whole of it. I remember looking at her when the words were being said and thinking, this is a woman who saw me. Not a version of me, not what she wished I was, not what I might become if everything went right. Me as I was in that yard with my crooked history and my quiet and my years on the trail and all of it. She'd looked at all of that and said, yes. That's not a small thing. I've thought about it for 40 years since, and it still isn't. Harlow lived 7 more years after we came to him. He died in the winter in his chair by the fire, the way he'd always said he wanted to. Cole and I buried him on the high ground east of the barn, where he'd asked to be buried, where you can see the whole of the plain from horizon to horizon. We kept the ranch between us. It made sense. I'm old now. I know I'm old because the cold hurts in ways it didn't used to, and I take longer on the morning chores than I did at 40. My hands are about used up, the knuckles are thick, and some mornings I have to work at them for a while before they'll cooperate. The horse I ride now is gentler than any horse I'd have ridden 30 years ago, and I don't mind. She's a gray mare named Dolly that one of Cole's boys raised, and I've had her 6 years, and she suits me. The ranch has changed, not in any one dramatic way, but the way things change when time works on them slowly and the changes add up. There's a second house now on the north section, Cole's boy Frank and his wife and their 3 children, a house that went up 2 summers ago and that I helped frame when my back let me. There's good fencing all the way to the creek now, something Harlow always wanted but never finished. The windmill runs better than it did when I fixed it the first time. Cole's youngest took it apart 2 years ago and rebuilt it mostly from scratch, and it's been quiet since. The winter wheat has been good 3 years running. Nora is still in this house. That sentence still lands on me sometimes with a weight I'm grateful for. After 40 years, I still find myself surprised she chose me, Not in a miserable way, not in a way that doubts her, but in the way you feel when something good stays good and doesn't get smaller. She's white-haired and she still moves through the days with that particular purposefulness. Still has opinions about how things should be done and says them plainly. Still looks at me when I'm speaking the way she's always looked at me, like I'm someone worth listening to. There's a moment that happens most evenings when the sun is going down and the work of the day is done, and she comes and stands on the porch next to me. She doesn't say anything, usually. Neither do I, we just stand in the light. And the country is out there the way it's always been, big and indifferent and beautiful in its own hard way. And I'm aware of her beside me, the warmth of her, the particular way she holds herself. This happens every evening that the weather allows, has happened for 40 years, and it has never gotten ordinary. I think about who I was in that second year of writing, the man lying on the ground south of the Cimarron looking at a sky full of stars, 43 years old with nothing to his name but a horse and a promise that had outlived its reason. I think about how close I came to continuing north, finding Sutter one way or the other, and then going on writing, which is what we would have done. Kept writing until the road ran out or one of us was buried along it. She held my face in her hands once, in a fire-lit room while a storm pressed against the walls, and told me she meant it. She has gone on meaning it every day since without making a production of it. That's who she is. That's the kind of person she is. She gave me back to myself. That's the plainest way to say it. Not by being soft with me or easy on me, she was neither. But by asking the right question at the right time, and by looking at me the way she looked at everything and seeing what was actually there, not what she wished was there, not what would have been convenient. She saw the man I was, the whole accounting of him, and she said yes, and she keeps saying it. That's a gift that doesn't diminish. 40 years on, and it still weighs what it weighed the first night. I think about Cole's question sometimes, about Wyoming, about what would have happened. And then I look at the country from the porch, the flat of it, the grass, the sky that at this hour is going red and orange above the ridge to the west. And I look at this house, which is a good house, and I think about Nora inside it, moving through the rooms the way she's always moved, certain and purposeful and present. The stars will come out in an hour, they always do. A man makes promises when he's young and doesn't know what they'll cost. And sometimes the best thing that can happen is to come to a cold fire on an open plain with someone who's known him long enough to see it and say the thing that's true, I'm tired, I want to stop. And then before the sun comes up to have a woman look at you in the dark and say, what do you want? Not what you owe, not what you promised. What you want, and for you to know the answer. And for the answer to be standing in the kitchen right now, putting the lamp out before she comes to bed, and for her to come through the door in a minute and find you on the porch looking at the stars, and for her to say, just like she always does, come in, it's cold, and for you to come in. That's the whole of it, or the whole of what I can tell in one sitting. The rest is just years, the good kind.